Shocking. The palace never saw this coming. The moment Queen Camilla was stripped of her title, not by the king, but by a royal guard who defied silence and made history tremble. Behind closed doors, crowns were moved, loyalties shattered, and Prince William was crowned in her place. What really happened inside Buckingham Palace will leave you speechless. Watch till the end, like and subscribe now. The corridors of Buckingham Palace rarely knew silence, but that morning, even the marble seemed to hold its breath. Rain streaked the tall windows, blurring the city outside, and within those golden halls, tension moved like a hidden draft. Every step echoed sharper than it should have. Every glance lingered longer than was safe. Sergeant Alaric Denim, Royal Guard Command, stood in the grand corridor where portraits of monarchs watched the living with eternal judgment. He had guarded sovereigns for 16 years, from state visits to funerals, but never had duty felt heavier than today. Because today was not a ceremony, it was a reckoning. He had been summoned by the Lord Chamberlain just before dawn, handed a single envelope sealed in crimson wax. Inside, a royal decree, direct, undisputed, and final. No ceremony, no witnesses, only one command. Execute as written. Protect the crown's integrity above all. The signature at the bottom made his chest tighten. King Charles R. Outside the east archway, Queen Camilla was arriving late for the ceremonial inspection, an event meant to symbolize continuity between monarch and guard. But something in her manner had changed. The ease of command in her stride had become arrogance. The grace of her tone had hardened into something colder. Authority claimed, "Not earned. Tell Lord Kendish the gold room is to be set for 24. "Not 30, she ordered crisply as she crossed the courtyard. "And have the regimental band moved to the South Garden before His Majesty's arrival. Her sovereign grace does not enjoy brass indoors." Denim's jaw tightened beneath the brim of his hat. Her sovereign grace, that title did not exist. It had never existed. It was a creation of her own design, the kind of phrase that ignored centuries of structure for a moment of personal grandeur. The aides around her obeyed without question, not because they agreed, but because no one dared to correct her anymore. She had become a presence too practiced, too untouchable. And yet the one thing she could not command was loyalty born of respect. As she passed the East Arch, she gave Denim a passing glance, fleeting, dismissive. "Stand tall, Sergeant. The press will see us soon." "Yes, Your Majesty," he replied, steady and respectful. But his mind was on the letter in his pocket. He had read the order 5 times, each word carved into his memory like stone. The final line had struck him hardest. If the crown forgets its humility, you must remind it what it means to serve. He did not know yet what that meant, not fully, but he knew this morning was no coincidence. Inside the ballroom, the staff moved in silent precision. Footmen arranged chairs, secretaries whispered schedules, photographers from the royal press office waited near the pillars. The ceremony was supposed to be a light-hearted affair, a symbolic passing of unity between the king and the queen, consort before the upcoming Commonwealth reception. But whispers had spread among senior staff that Camilla had prepared something unscripted, something that went beyond symbolism. When the king entered, applause rippled lightly through the hall. Charles looked weary but composed, nodding to each aide he passed. Camilla approached him with her usual poise, but there was something sharper in her smile, something that made the air thinner. "My love," she said softly, though her words carried. "Shall we begin?" The king took his place at the dais. "Proceed." The herald began the formal introduction, the speech that celebrated unity, grace, and the shared burden of monarchy. But halfway through, Camilla stepped forward, lifting her hand slightly to interrupt. "I believe," she began, her tone calm but commanding, "that unity requires clarity. The public must understand where power truly resides, not merely as a reflection of tradition, but as recognition of service." Charles frowned slightly. "Camilla," she turned to face the audience. "In this new era, where the monarchy meets the modern world, I believe we must acknowledge that the future of the crown requires balance and leadership." Denim shifted slightly from his post at the door. The aides exchanged nervous glances. Camilla smiled faintly and continued. Therefore, as Queen Consort, and in dedication to His Majesty's legacy, I shall assume ceremonial leadership of certain royal proceedings in my own right. A murmur rippled through the room. That was not in the script. Charles' voice was low but firm. Camilla, this is neither the time nor the place. But she turned toward him with the subtle confidence of someone who believed she had already won. The time, my king, is precisely now. The words struck the hall like a crack of thunder. Even the photographers lowered their cameras, and that was when Sergeant Denim stepped forward. He had not spoken out of turn in 16 years of service, but the decree in his pocket gave him the authority and the burden to act. He raised his voice, not loudly, but with the weight of command. By order of His Majesty's sealed decree, he said, drawing the envelope from his coat. The authority of the crown rests solely with the reigning monarch, and none may assume leadership without consent or parliament sanction. The room froze. Camilla's face paled slightly. What are you implying, Sergeant? Denim stepped closer, unfolding the paper so all could see the crimson seal. That as of this morning, by royal decree, all ceremonial duties previously assigned to the Queen Consort are suspended pending review. Her breath caught. The aides looked to the king, who did not speak. His silence said everything. For a moment the Queen stood perfectly still. Then with an almost imperceptible tremor she asked, "Is this your doing, Charles?" The king lowered his gaze. "It is the crown's doing." The sound of silence inside Buckingham Palace's East Ballroom was almost painful. No one dared to move, no one dared to breathe. The echo of Sergeant Alaric Denim's voice still lingered in the golden air, clinging to every chandelier and marble column like invisible smoke. The paper in his hand, bearing the crimson royal seal, seemed to weigh more than the crown itself. Queen Camilla's eyes locked on him, sharp and furious, yet beneath that fire there was disbelief. No one, no servant, no advisor, not even a guard, had ever spoken to her like that in public. The press lenses had stopped clicking. The aides were frozen in a tableau of fear and confusion. "Sergeant," she said slowly, the steel in her tone barely hiding the tremor underneath, "you are exceeding your station." Denim did not blink. "With respect, Your Majesty, the station I serve is the crown. Its command is absolute." Her lips parted in shock. The words weren't insolence, they were truth, and they carried the authority of the king's own signature. King Charles sat silently at the dais, his gaze fixed on the floor. There was no triumph in his face, no satisfaction, only sorrow. The weight of leadership had turned heavier than gold. Camilla turned toward him, her voice low, dangerous. "You sanctioned this?" Charles exhaled slowly. "It is not punishment, Camilla. It is preservation." "Preservation?" she echoed, incredulous. "You humiliate me in front of the court, revoke my authority, and call it preservation." Charles rose to his feet. The murmurs quieted instantly. "I call it correction," he said evenly. "The monarchy cannot afford pride disguised as purpose." The words struck harder than any order Denim had ever delivered. Camilla stood motionless, eyes glistening though she refused to let the tears fall. "You forget yourself, Charles," she whispered. "Without me, the modern crown would have no voice." Charles's reply was soft, but every syllable carried. "Then let the people hear the crown's silence again." She drew a sharp breath, her composure cracking for the first time. Around them, the aides bowed their heads. The pressmen slowly lowered their cameras. No one dared to document what felt like history rewriting itself in real time. Denim took one step forward, voice steady as granite. "By decree, the ceremonial title of Queen Consort is hereby suspended until further royal review. You are to remain within your private quarters pending further advisement." The echo of his words filled the hall like thunder trapped in marble. Camilla turned toward him, her tone trembling with fury and disbelief. "You speak those words as if they are your own." "No, ma'am," Denim replied. "I speak them as your guard." Her gaze faltered for just a moment, long enough for everyone to see that she understood. The monarchy wasn't rejecting her. The crown was. Then slowly, she reached up to touch the diamond brooch on her chest, the same one she had worn during the coronation. Its shine seemed dimmer now. "You think this will save him?" she said quietly, looking toward the king. "You think stripping me will silence the divisions outside these walls?" Charles met her eyes with weary sadness. "No, but it will remind them that the throne still governs itself." The silence that followed was suffocating. At last, she straightened her posture, her dignity still intact despite the blow. "Then I will not resist. But understand this, Charles. Power has memory. And the people will not forget what you've done today." Denim stepped aside as two palace aides approached. They were hesitant but firm. She gave them a look of quiet defiance before turning toward the hall's massive double doors. The sound of her heels against the marble floor echoed like distant drums. As she reached the threshold, she paused and turned once more, not to the king, but to the guard. "Sergeant," she said, her voice low but cutting. "You may hold your orders, but you will never understand the burden they carry." Denim met her gaze with quiet resolve. "Duty carries its own burden, ma'am, and I am not meant to understand, only to obey." Her expression softened just slightly. Perhaps for the first time she saw the humanity behind the uniform. Then she turned and walked out. The doors closed with a slow, echoing finality. For a long moment the king remained still, the weight of silence pressing down on him. Then he turned toward Denim. "Sergeant," he said quietly, "you have fulfilled your duty. But what you witnessed here must remain sealed in loyalty." Denim bowed deeply. "It will, Your Majesty." As the king dismissed the court, one of the junior aides whispered, "Sir, what happens now?" Charles looked toward the grand crown displayed on the stand beside the throne. "Now," he said, "we make room for the future." That future arrived sooner than anyone expected. Later that night, a royal notice was issued to the press, a brief, official statement written in polished diplomacy. Her Majesty Queen Camilla has requested a temporary withdrawal from royal duties for personal reflection. His Majesty the King has approved the reassignment of ceremonial responsibilities to the Prince of Wales. The world outside saw grace, but those inside Buckingham Palace knew it for what it truly was, an abdication of influence. And at the center of it stood a single man in scarlet, whose silence had reshaped royal history without a single act of rebellion. The rain had stopped over Buckingham Palace, but the storm within its walls was far from over. The world outside had accepted the palace's carefully worded statement, but those who served within the marble corridors knew the truth, a truth sealed by royal command and guarded by silence. Sergeant Alaric Denim walked through the palace's inner courtyard at dawn, his boots clicking softly against damp stone. The sky above was pale and uncertain, streaked with the silver light of an approaching sunrise, the kind of light that made everything look both fragile and eternal. In the guardroom, the whispers had already begun. "Did you hear? The prince has been summoned to Windsor. They say the queen won't return. Some say the sergeant spoke the words himself." Denim ignored them. He was not a man who fed rumors. He was a man who carried orders. And the latest one had arrived sealed in gold, bearing the king's personal crest. It was not a command for protection. It was a command for preparation. At precisely 9 o'clock, he was summoned to the king's private office. Charles was standing near the window, his reflection fractured by the raindrops that still clung to the glass. He looked older than he had the day before, not weaker, but stripped of illusions. "Sergeant," the king said softly, "you've seen what happens when power forgets humility. Now we must remind the world that humility still rules the crown." Denim bowed. "Your Majesty, what do you require?" The king turned slowly, his expression unreadable. "An act of tradition, one that will not be televised, not announced, not spoken of until its time. Prince William will assume provisional stewardship of the crown's ceremonial duties." Denim hesitated. "A private coronation, sir?" "Not in name," the king replied, "but in purpose." The silence between them was heavy. The implication was clear. This would not just be a ceremony. It would be a transfer of trust, and perhaps of destiny. Charles continued, his tone solemn. "You will oversee the proceedings. Only 3 of us will bear witness. Myself, the prince, and you. The monarchy must transition with dignity, not debate." Denim straightened. Yes, Your Majesty. Good, the king said quietly. Because history will never record it, but conscience will. By mid-afternoon, the palace chapel had been prepared. The gold lectern gleamed beneath a halo of candlelight. The air smelled faintly of oak and incense. No orchestra played, no heralds announced arrivals. Only 3 men entered, the king, the prince, and the guard. Prince William stepped forward, his face calm, but shadowed by thought. He wore a simple navy suit, no medals, no sash. His eyes carried both the weight of duty and the hesitation of a man stepping into something vast and irreversible. "Father," he began quietly, "are you certain this is the right course?" "The people love her." Charles nodded, though his voice was weary. "They love what they see, not what they do not. The monarchy is not a mirror for admiration. It is a vessel for sacrifice." William's gaze shifted to the crown resting on the velvet cushion, the very symbol of continuity, now caught between generations. "And what of Mother?" he asked softly. The king looked down. "She served her part, but service without humility becomes spectacle. The people will remember her kindness." "That is enough." The silence stretched. Then, almost instinctively, William looked to Sergeant Denim, the man standing at attention beside the altar. "You were there, weren't you?" "When it happened," Denim met his gaze. "Yes, Your Royal Highness. And you enforced it?" "I executed the king's order," Denim replied evenly. William's eyes narrowed, not in anger but in thought. "That takes courage." Denim's tone remained calm. "It takes loyalty, sir. Courage is merely the echo of obedience when it costs something." The prince studied him for a long moment, then turned back to the altar. "Very well," he said quietly. "Let us begin." The ceremony that followed would never be written in any record. There was no throne, no coronation chair, no golden canopy. Only a father, a son, and a soldier. The king lifted the crown from its cushion. Its jewels caught the candlelight, scattering sparks of crimson and sapphire across the stone floor.
He held it not above William's head, but between them. A symbol, not yet a transfer. Then he spoke softly. "By right and by burden, by faith and by doubt, I entrust the continuity of this realm to your hands."
"Not as heir, but as guardian. Until such time as the people call for you, you will serve, unseen yet steadfast." William lowered his head. "I accept not for glory, but for duty." The king's voice wavered slightly. "Then let it be so." He turned to Denim. "Sergeant, you are the witness of this act. Let history remember that the crown was not taken, but entrusted." Denim drew himself upright, his voice steady and sure. "I so swear, Your Majesty. The crown remains loyal to its service, and its service remains loyal to the truth." The king nodded once. Then, with deliberate care, he set the crown upon the velvet once more. The silence that followed was sacred. When it ended, William turned to Denim and extended his hand, an act no royal had ever done to a guard before. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for reminding my father what courage looks like." Denim clasped the hand firmly but respectfully. "Courage, sir, is contagious, and it begins where silence ends." Outside the chapel, the rain began again, soft, steady, cleansing. The palace lights glowed warm against the storm's grey curtain, and in that private, unrecorded moment, the future of the crown shifted, not with fanfare, not with rebellion, but with quiet obedience and unshakable honor. A guard had done what few dared to do. He had spoken truth to royalty, and now, in silence, he had helped crown a future king. The day after the private coronation, Buckingham Palace looked unchanged on the outside, but within, it felt colder. The air that once hummed with confidence now pulsed with quiet suspicion. Footmen spoke in whispers, aides avoided eye contact, and even the chandeliers seemed to shimmer with unease. Something sacred had shifted, not in ceremony, but in loyalty. Sergeant Alaric Denim felt it most. As he crossed the grand gallery on his morning patrol, the servants' eyes followed him. They knew his face now, the man who had read the decree, who had spoken where silence once ruled. To the guards he was duty-made flesh. To Camilla's circle, he was the man who had destroyed their queen's throne. In the inner courtyard, Lieutenant Grace Alden approached him, her voice low. "They're saying Camilla's staff is refusing to leave Clarence House. The chambermaids, her private secretaries, even her press advisor. They're calling it an internal protest." Denim's jaw tightened. "A palace doesn't protest. It obeys," Grace hesitated. "Not anymore. Last night, a private vehicle entered from the west gate without clearance, driven by one of her attendants. They took files, communications, finance records, something else." He stopped walking. "What kind of something else?" She lowered her tone. "It's believed she kept a personal copy of the Crown Transition Ledger, a document outlining who approved every ceremonial transfer of authority since the coronation." Denim frowned deeply. That ledger was never meant to leave Windsor. It was the Crown's most closely guarded record, proof of what truly transpired between Charles, Camilla, and William. If it were to reach the press, the monarchy wouldn't survive another sunrise. "Where is the car now?" he asked. "Unaccounted for," Grace replied. "We have roadblocks near Kensington, but if it's already out of London—" Denim didn't let her finish. "Prepare a detail. I want access to every palace entry log and communications tower within 10 miles. If they've taken that ledger, they've taken the heart of the monarchy's truth." Grace looked uneasy. "And if we find them?" He glanced toward the rising flag above the tower. "Then we remind them what loyalty means." Meanwhile, deep inside Clarence House, the atmosphere was thick with resentment. The Queen Consort's aides gathered in the Blue Room, their faces drawn and pale. Lady Helena Roth, Camilla's longtime companion and strategist, stood at the center, holding a half-burned letter in one hand and a phone in the other. "They humiliated her," Helena hissed. "In her own palace. And now they expect her to fade quietly into the background like an old painting." "No, not yet." One of the secretaries, trembling, asked, "What can we do?" "The order came directly from the king." Helena's eyes glinted. "Orders are temporary. Legacy is permanent. We have the ledger. If the king and his guard want to rewrite history, let's remind them that history has witnesses." "But leaking that file would destroy the monarchy?" Helena interrupted. "Perhaps. But it would also reveal how the guard overstepped, how the king used military command to strip a queen of her title. The people adore fairness. They'll call it injustice before they ever call it treason." No one spoke. The logic was dangerous, but undeniable. At that moment, a voice came from the hallway. Calm, composed, but unmistakably firm. "And who, Lady Helena, will they call loyal when the dust settles?" Every head turned. Sergeant Denim stood in the doorway, flanked by 2 guards. His uniform was immaculate, but his expression carried none of the cold formality of duty. It carried something sharper, purpose. Helena's hand tightened around the letter. "You have no authority here, Sergeant." He stepped forward, his boots echoing across the polished floor. "Authority is not granted by rooms, my lady. It is upheld by truth, and truth belongs to the crown." "You mean the king?" she shot back. "No," Denim said quietly. "I mean the crown." Helena smirked faintly, but her eyes betrayed her nerves. "And what would you do if I told you the ledger is already gone?" Denim met her gaze without flinching. "Then I'd tell you it's already been copied." "We anticipated the breach." Her expression froze. "You're lying, perhaps," he said evenly. "But if I'm not, then the next person to see that document will not be a journalist. It will be the king himself." Helena's confidence faltered for the first time. She turned toward the secretary beside her, whispering, "Check the courier." The young man hesitated. "My lady, the courier hasn't reported back." The room went still. Denim took a slow step forward. "The monarchy survives not because of power, my lady, but because of restraint. You think loyalty is blind, but it isn't. It sees everything. It simply refuses to act without honor." Helena's voice cracked. "Honor?" "Yes," Denim said. "The kind your queen once had before ambition replaced it." The word struck her harder than any accusation. She looked down, eyes glistening with something between rage and regret. Finally, she whispered, "Take it then. Take the crown's precious truth. But tell your king this. Camilla may have lost her title, but she will never lose her story." Denim nodded once, solemnly. "Then let her story remain where it belongs, behind palace walls." He took the envelope from her desk and turned away. The guards followed him out, the door closing behind them with finality. Hours later, back in Windsor, Denim placed the recovered ledger on the king's desk. Charles looked up from his seat, eyes weary but calm. "You found it?" "Yes, sir," Denim said. "But not before it nearly found its way to the world." The king nodded slowly. "And what of Camilla's circle?" "Disbanded," Denim replied. "They will speak no more of this." The king stared at the leather-bound ledger for a long time, then whispered, "Every kingdom loses its shine when its walls hold secrets." Denim's answer was quiet but resolute. "Then perhaps, Your Majesty, it is time to let the truth shine instead." Night fell over Windsor Castle like a velvet curtain. The corridors were quiet, the air heavy with the faint scent of rain-soaked stone. In the king's study, a single lamp burned, throwing soft gold light across the desk where King Charles III sat alone. Before him lay the Crown Transition Ledger, its leather cover worn, its pages thick with the weight of history and secrets. For hours, he had stared at it without turning a page. The guard who retrieved it, Sergeant Alaric Denim, stood at attention by the door, silent as a statue. Finally, Charles spoke. "When you look at this, Sergeant, what do you see?" Denim replied evenly. "A record of duty, Your Majesty." The king's lips curved into a faint, sorrowful smile. "Duty," he repeated softly. "Yes, that word has been my companion longer than anyone else." He opened the book. The inked names of kings and queens filled the pages. Elizabeth, George, Edward. Then came his own, barely dry. But beneath his signature lay something that had not been there before. A folded sheet of parchment sealed with the emblem of ER2, the late Queen's personal cipher. Charles froze. Slowly he broke the wax seal and unfolded it. The writing was unmistakable. His mother's graceful script. Written with the same steady hand that had signed declarations, treaties, and vows that shaped nations. He read aloud quietly. "My dearest Charles, if this letter finds you after my reign, then know this. The weight you carry is not the crown's, but your own heart. You will be tested by loyalty disguised as love, and by ambition disguised as service. When that day comes, do not ask who deserves power. Ask instead who deserves trust," his voice faltered. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to continue. "If the crown must be humbled to survive, let it be done by your hand. And if the day ever comes when truth stands against tradition, choose truth, even if it costs you the throne." Silence filled the room. The ticking of the clock sounded like a heartbeat against the stone walls. Denim spoke softly. "She foresaw this, sir." The king nodded, his eyes glistening. "She did. Every word of it." He turned the parchment over, where one final line was written, "And trust the ones who serve quietly, for they will see what pride cannot." Charles looked up slowly at Denim. "She was speaking of you." Denim's expression didn't change. "She was speaking of anyone who remembers what service truly means, Your Majesty." The king closed the ledger gently, his fingers trembling. "You've seen what power does to those who forget their purpose. I have lived long enough to know that kings and queens are not chosen to rule. They are chosen to remember." He rose from his chair and walked toward the window. Beyond the glass, the lights of London glimmered faintly, distant and indifferent. Camilla's fall was not hers alone. It was mine, too. I let her believe that the crown could be shared, when in truth, it must always be protected, not possessed. Denim remained silent. "I loved her," Charles said, his voice cracking. "I still do. But love cannot govern a nation, and when affection blinds judgment, the crown becomes a mirror of weakness." He turned back to the desk, his eyes suddenly sharp again. "Tomorrow I will announce that William will assume full ceremonial duties until further notice. Quietly, formally. There will be no rebellion, no whispers of scandal, only transition." Denim bowed his head. "The people will see continuity, not collapse." "Yes," the king said. "And perhaps that is the truest form of strength. To let go with dignity, rather than rule with defiance." He looked directly at Denim. "You once told me that courage begins where silence ends. I think I finally understand." The guard straightened. "Your Majesty, Courage also means standing still when the world demands you move. The king gave a faint, knowing smile. And you, Sergeant, have done both. Later that night, as the castle slept, the king made one final entry in the ledger. His handwriting was deliberate, almost ceremonial. By royal judgment, the stewardship of the crown's ceremonial legacy is hereby entrusted to His Royal Highness, the Prince of Wales, to ensure the continuity of duty and the preservation of truth. He signed his name beneath it, but then, in a rare act of humility, added another line below his signature. Witnessed and upheld by Sergeant Alaric Denim, guardian of the crown's honor. The ink dried slowly, dark and permanent. When Denim stepped forward to collect the book for safekeeping, the king placed a hand on his shoulder. You've stood guard over monarchs, Sergeant. Now stand guard over history. Denim bowed deeply. Until my last breath, sir. As he left the study, he passed beneath portraits of kings who had ruled through blood and fear. But tonight, history would remember something different. Not a war, not a rebellion, but a moment of truth crowned in silence. In the stillness of that night, the king watched the candle burn low and whispered to the empty room, Mother, I finally chose truth. And somewhere beyond the storm, the crown, unshaken, unbroken, seemed to shine a little brighter. Dawn broke over Windsor Castle with the pale hush of a kingdom trying to forget what it had endured. The storm had passed, yet its echo lingered in the walls, in the faces of every guard and servant who now carried the memory of something history would never record. A queen's fall, a king's confession, and the rebirth of a crown through truth. Sergeant Alaric Denim stood on the east balcony overlooking the courtyard. Below, the royal standard fluttered proudly, but it felt different now, less a symbol of dominance, more a reminder of endurance. He had been awake all night, replaying the king's words. The letter from the late queen, the signature that marked him forever as the guardian of the crown's honor. But peace, he knew, never lasted long in a palace built on secrets. The first sign of trouble came not from within, but from the outside world. The morning papers, the Guardian, the Telegraph, the Daily Mail, all carried the same headline. Sources claim power shift inside Buckingham Palace, Prince William to assume royal duties. Denim's jaw tightened as he read the smaller print. Anonymous aides close to Clarence House alleged the Queen Consort's removal was forced by palace security under direct military command. He didn't need to ask who had leaked it. Lady Helena Roth, Camilla's former advisor, had kept her promise. She will never lose her story. The story was out. By noon, reporters were swarming the palace gates, cameras flashing like lightning, questions flying through the rain. The monarchy's silence only made the noise louder. Inside the palace, chaos had replaced calm. The communications staff were panicking, the senior aides divided. Some believed the crown should release a statement defending the king. Others urged total silence, and at the heart of it all stood the man who had carried out the order, the man they were now calling the guard who dethroned a queen. Denim moved through the corridors with quiet authority, but everywhere he turned, eyes followed him, admiration from some, suspicion from others. To them he was both hero and executioner. When he entered the king's private chambers, Charles was already waiting, holding a letter that had just been delivered from the Prime Minister's office. They want clarification, the king said grimly. They're worried this will destabilize the Commonwealth. They want to know if Camilla's removal was lawful. It was, Your Majesty, Denim replied evenly. The decree was signed, sealed, and witnessed. Charles sighed. Legality is not the same as perception, Sergeant. They do not question my authority. They question my judgment. He walked to the window, staring out at the courtyard where the press clustered like a storm waiting to break. I wanted truth, he said quietly. But truth comes with consequence. Denim nodded. Then we face it with the same courage that brought it here. Before the king could respond, the door opened. Prince William entered, his expression calm but determined. Father, he said, let me speak for you. Charles turned. The world will assume this was your doing. William smiled faintly. Then let them. The crown survives not by avoiding storms, but by standing still through them. You've done your duty, father. Now let me do mine. The king studied his son for a long moment, the steadiness in his voice, the quiet conviction in his gaze. Then, with a nod, he said softly, "Then it is time the world met its future." By late afternoon, the press briefing was underway. 1,000 lenses pointed toward the gilded steps of Buckingham Palace as Prince William emerged in full uniform, the king standing just behind him. The crowd roared with questions. But the prince raised his hand for silence. His words were simple, measured, but every sentence struck like a hammer forged from calm and truth. The monarchy has endured for centuries, not because of perfection, but because of principle. My father has acted not to diminish the crown, but to protect it from pride. The queen consort's withdrawal was not exile, it was preservation. And as of today, by his will, I accept stewardship of the crown's ceremonial duties, not as a ruler, but as a servant. The courtyard went silent. The cameras clicked, but no one spoke. Then William turned, gesturing toward the soldiers lined at the archway. "And to those who serve quietly in red and gold, men like Sergeant Alaric Denim, know this. History will not remember the titles you enforced, but the truth you protected." The crowd erupted in applause. Inside the palace, Charles watched from the balcony, tears glinting in his tired eyes. "He sounds just like her," he whispered, not meaning Camilla, but Elizabeth. Denim, standing beside him, bowed his head. Then perhaps her legacy lives through him. That evening, as dusk fell over the city, Denim returned to the royal chapel, the same place where the private coronation had taken place weeks before. The candles flickered softly, their light reflected in the polished marble. He stood before the altar, the ledger in his hands. It had been resealed, its story now complete. But one thought lingered in his mind, the Queen's final line, "Trust the ones who serve quietly." As he placed the book back into the vault, he whispered, "Your Majesty, the guard still stands." Behind him, the great bells of Windsor began to toll, deep and solemn, each chime carried across the night, not as mourning, but as renewal. The monarchy had survived betrayal, scandal, and truth itself. And through it all, one man had stood unshaken. The soldier who had once relieved a queen of her title had now safeguarded a king's redemption. And when history was finally written, his name might not appear in its pages, but his silence would echo through them forever. In a world of crowns and corruption, one man's loyalty restored a kingdom's soul. Watch till the end, drop your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more royal stories of courage, truth, and redemption that prove power fades, but integrity never dies.